Hi all, my name is Cheng Zin. I'm from Baker Tilly Internal Audit and Risk Advisory. So thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to the webinar. So today I will be speaking about climate risk and why every business should be thinking of climate change risk, and Joshua will be speaking on ESG. So today I'll be covering 9 key points, including what is risk management, what is climate change, what is climate risk for businesses, sectors most affected by climate risk, why businesses need to act, leaders in addressing climate change, climate reporting framework, and the next steps for Malaysian businesses. All right, so good risk management is not so much about risk elimination than it is about risk optimization. For example, balancing the risk and opportunity of a company, which requires an understanding of the company's risk profile. So good risk management starts with a proper risk assessment. The sooner companies identify and assess the new types of risks, the better they can act to decrease the probability of incurring losses in the years to come as a result of costs of complying to new regulations or damage costs due to, for example, climate-induced natural disasters. So we will discuss the ongoing and emerging risks that should be addressed by Malaysian companies in their risk framework and profile, being climate risk, physical, transition, and liability. So recent climate events. So this comes as the world just experienced its hottest year on record. We can see now all around the world the inescapable heat, the wildfires, and the unrelenting drought and water shortages. Due to the extreme heat waves, there are forest fires across the world through the US, Brazil, Australia, Europe. There are hurricanes and torrential rainfall causing flooding in China, India, Europe, and America. There's significant melting of ice at the Arctic causing ice loss and rising sea levels enough to cover entire states in 2 inches of water. While Malaysia appears unaffected by the most extreme weather events, such as earthquakes, hurricanes, and fires, it remains vulnerable to the threat of floods, landslides, and haze and water pollution. So the World Bank's Climate Country Risk Profile noted that the frequency and extremity of flood events in Malaysia have increased in recent decades, and it is projected to continue increasing due to the global warming. So according to Michael E. Mann, a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, states that bottom line is that we have 0 years left to avoid dangerous climate change because it is here. Okay, so what is climate risk? Nowadays, everyone is concerned about the environmental impacts which escalates into global warming caused by carbon footprint. Carbon footprint is the entire combination of greenhouse gas emissions which is self-inflicted by the human race. Activities of human beings such as the burning of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, over-exploitation of the natural resources, deforestation, and mismanagement of waste have caused a climate crisis throughout the effect of greenhouse gases. So this led to the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2016, an agreement with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to limit temperature to well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5 degrees to adapt to the impact of climate change and to make money available to deliver these aims. The targets set out by the UN Paris Agreement has been adopted by almost every nation in the world, including Malaysia. So as you've all heard of, more recently at the recent 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference referred to as COP26, which was held in Glasgow, UK for 2 weeks, brought together all the world leaders to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. So COP26 concluded in Glasgow with all countries agreeing that on the climate pact to keep the 1.5 degrees alive. The Climate Finance Delivery Plan published by COP26 provided clarity on when and how developed nations will meet the 100 billion climate finance goal. So this is the first time that China and the US have stood up, the 2 biggest emitters in the world, and said that we're going to work together to accelerate the reduction. Thereafter, Bank Negara Malaysia released a statement in November 2021 to be in conjunction with COP26, has reiterated its willingness to contribute in meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement and to expand and strengthen the collective efforts towards greening the financial system. All right, so the statistics from BNM, the natural disasters events over the past 20 years, accounting to RM 8 billion of total damage, and more than 3 million people affected, including displacement, injury, and death due to these natural disasters. Okay, what does climate risk mean for businesses? In the recent years, terminology has emerged for the different types of climate risks that businesses face in the form of physical, transition, and liability risks. So, physical risks, which include storm, heavy rain, floods, landslides, drought, heat waves, water shortages, that may have serious implications on the physical assets, supply chains, and operational impact on a company. A simple example is the flood destroying a production plant. Transition risk: as the world transitions to a low carbon economy, new policy, regulations, laws, market, technology trends are emerging. Companies can expect to face increasing pressure to provide disclosure on how they address climate change and the impact to their business. For example, the energy industry is one sector very open to transitional risks as governments are increasingly shifting their reliance on to renewable energy resources and demanding a net zero carbon emission from energy producers. Liability and reputational risks: they arise from a failure to mitigate, adapt to, disclose, or comply with changing legal and regulatory expectations. For example, companies that pollute will be exposed to potential litigation, but so are companies associated with insufficient action to curb climate change in their products and services. An example is property developers that fail to consider increased intensity of rainfall and to then improve their drainage system in flood-prone areas. Okay, so any company will be impacted by different proportions of these risks: physical, transition, and liability. Some will be more worried by regulatory requirements, while other industries might be more concerned on the loss of assets through physical damage. But companies should consider all these risks in their risk profile, both short and long term. Translated, this means that without adequate preparation, there is an increased risk of business disruptions in frequency, cost, and duration. So sectors most affected and exposed to climate-related risks. So an important factor for companies is access to finance, which is increasingly linked to climate-related risks because financial institutions are themselves exposed to more credit, market, and reputational risks as a consequence of their clients' climate-related ones. Hence, companies with high climate-related risks or poor ESG performance may find it increasingly difficult to raise capital on financial markets. Within the financial sector for now, transition risks have been more of a concern compared to the physical ones. So physical risks may affect businesses in agriculture and plantation whose production depends on climatic conditions or the availability of natural resources. Some areas will be more prone to drought and prolonged dry periods, while others will be affected by heavy and unpredictable rainfall. Sectors including energy, utilities, mining, transport, manufacturing, oil and gas are affected by transition and reputational risks. Within these sectors, businesses delaying adoption of existing economically low carbon technologies are particularly exposed to transition and reputational risks. Okay, so why do businesses need to act? Today, we have employees, customers, and investors pushing for companies to reduce their carbon footprints and demonstrate commitment to sustainable practices. Responsible business leaders want their organization to be good corporate citizens for at least two good reasons. One, because it is the right thing to do, and two, because they want to attract high-performing talent, new clients, and capital. So we start with number one, physical climate impact. So businesses, especially in sectors that depend on natural resources, need to adapt to new environmental conditions and increasingly frequent extreme weather events. So this has implications on companies with physical assets. As mentioned earlier, is material for sectors such as real estate, production, agriculture, plantation, forestry. Companies whose supply chains are dependent on vulnerable sectors would also benefit from exploring what these changing weather patterns mean for their businesses. For example, companies within the plantation sector in Malaysia may experience increased impact of climate change, specifically floods, and thereafter work to determine their risk response strategies and mitigation plans. All right, the next one is emerging regulatory pressure for improved climate disclosure continues to increase. The developed nations, stock exchange, and security regulators are setting out guidelines, mandating or regulating that companies disclose climate risks along with their financial earnings. In Malaysia, BNM, SC, and Islamic Bank are all looking to complete their audits in the area of carbon, water, waste, biodiversity, environment, and climate, and to identify their current gaps and shortfall so as to be able to put the right strategies in place to becoming greener. The Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance, published by the SC, which is applicable to all Malaysian PLCs, have been revised this year to include that the board, together with management, should ensure that the company's sustainability strategies, priorities, targets, and performance are communicated to internal and external stakeholders. The board must, with management, take appropriate action to ensure that they stay abreast with and understand the sustainability issues relevant to the company and its business, including climate-related risks and opportunities. Okay, third is customers and employees. So information availability, the advanced technology shifts, and new consumer preferences are transforming buying patterns for goods and services. Consumers are seeking products that have been sourced and manufactured with a reduced carbon footprint. As consumers develop increased expectations with respect to sustainable brands, companies must consider their competitive positioning. The trend is further accelerated by the pressure of social media and digital transparency, where young people, the consumers of our future, are particularly engaged in this topic. Increasingly, customers will seek out to do business with those companies whose sustainability and climate risk management practices are robust. Adopting sustainability practices can also attract the best talent, as many millennials now look to work for environmentally friendly companies. So investor pressure. According to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2021, a growing number of investors view climate change as a material investment risk, which increases the pressure for better climate information. The strong conviction shown by foreign institutional investors has begun to rub off on local investors. A number of them are becoming more vocal about raising climate-related matters at general meetings and/or vote against recalcitrant companies. In our view, the call for disclosure on potential business impacts will only increase in the coming years. Demonstrating to the shareholders that impact of climate change are being managed can, in addition, provide reputational benefits. So all the above will have spillover effects on the business environment. Therefore, establishing a structured environmental risk mitigation framework can help companies demonstrate that they are building resilience against emerging climate events. Last but not least, business opportunities. Firstly, companies can improve their resource productivity, for example, increasing energy efficiency, thereby reducing their costs. Secondly, there is an opportunity for businesses to spur innovation and gain a competitive advantage across a wide range of sectors. Climate change can encourage innovation and inspire products and services that are less carbon intensive. The services sector and legal firms may gain business in advising clients on the best way to evaluate, disclose, and reduce emissions, if any. A growing number of startup companies for cars are planning to sell tiny electric cars that carry 1 to 3 people. Companies can enhance the resilience of their supply chain, for example, by reducing reliance on the price-volatile fossil fuels by shifting towards renewable energy. Together, these actions can foster competitiveness and unlock new market opportunities. So we know that big corporations are mostly responsible for causing damage to the planet. Hence, in 2021, there were many initiatives that have been taken globally by the governments and major corporations. So apart from what the governments and countries are doing, there are some few examples of the initiatives of companies such as Nike, which is reselling lightly worn sneakers at a discount in an effort to reduce waste. Coca-Cola launching new bottles made of 100% recycled materials. H&M and Cotton On clothing retailers making clothes from sustainably sourced materials. Volvo and Ford aiming to sell electric cars by 2030. And at 11 Madison Park, a Michelin-starred restaurant announced that it will go completely plant-based in May 2021, reflecting a growing trend towards a move towards sustainable ingredients and food practices. So is there a climate reporting framework available for reference? Yes, there is a framework available, and this is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. TCFD is the key standard and framework for climate risk. The TCFD is an organization established in 2015 with the goal of developing a set of voluntary climate-related financial disclosures. This provides guidance for companies to disclose clear, comparable, and consistent information on the risks and opportunities presented by climate change. Despite the fact that disclosure against the recommendations of the TCFD remain voluntary, mandatory disclosure of climate risk is emerging as a vital area of regulatory focus. Regulators, listing authorities, public companies in many major jurisdictions have expressed support for this TCFD recommendation as a useful framework for disclosure and are paying close attention to their updates. In this regard, the TCFD recommendations provide a useful guidance to help companies identify and disclose their relevant climate risks and impacts that require attention. So these recommendations essentially can be applied to financial and non-financial companies across various industries and sectors. So the Singapore Exchange Regulation recently issued a public consultation paper proposing for climate-related disclosures based on TCFD recommendations to be made mandatory. It may not be long before Bursa follows suit. So with the examples of actions already taken by companies and around the world, Malaysian organizations, whether they be PLC or SME, should start to assess the inclusion of climate risk into their enterprise risk management framework and profile, not only to improve their climate resilience, but also to gain a competitive advantage. So this is a conversation that should be driven by all the boards and management now as a strategy moving forward. Companies must take actual actions to reduce emissions and mitigate risks, which will require a change in mindset towards the use of natural resources. This may include initiatives for change towards renewable energy and resources, solar and wind power, a reduction in the reliance on water resources, increasing energy efficiency, or as simple as implementing waste management practices. So simple steps that SMEs can take to fight climate change include reduce waste and fight obsolescence, recycling and responsible waste management, reduce the amount of waste generated, whether it be industrial waste of a large company or the paper waste of an SME or tertiary sector. All companies will produce waste. Raise awareness amongst the employees. So the best encouragement for your workforce is educating them about the impact their actions have on the environment. Reduce energy consumption. Focusing on energy reduction both in terms of sustainability and cost savings, many business owners start by updating their energy systems to LED lighting, optimizing heat and cooling systems, and installing products rated for efficiency. Promote environmentally friendly ways of working. So telecommuting, consider video conferences that avoid employees traveling by cars for meeting with clients. Try to work paperless where possible. Avoid to copy an entire company in an email that only concerns one department that can save a lot of CO2 emissions. And optimize employees' transportation. Encourage public transport or carpool where possible. So in conclusion, the business landscape is changing very quickly with new risks and opportunities becoming increasingly linked to the planet's fever. Companies embracing climate risk assessment and management early on have bigger chances of prospering in the next decades. So the COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example to demonstrate the interconnectedness between nature and society, as well as the need for multilateral and collective efforts in overcoming a global challenge. Thus, it is important that we embrace business strategies that protect the environment to prevent the climate crisis looming in the background. Focusing on the sustainability and climate risk in business models and corporate governance can give businesses a lasting competitive advantage. Companies can do so by leveraging on their existing ERM and risk assessment processes to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks and opportunities, increase the awareness amongst management, consider areas of analysis and risk mitigation, and develop appropriate management approaches. So to put simply, and as a starting point, we believe that Malaysian business leaders must start asking the following questions now for tomorrow. Does the climate risk affect my business through physical impact, transition, or liability risk, and to what degree of each? As a publicly listed company, what do I need to disclose? Are there regulatory policies applicable to our company and specific industry which we need to identify and address? Are climate-related issues considered in our management and strategy discussions? Do our risk management and governance systems consider climate change? How robust is our business under different climate-related scenarios? Are there climate-related opportunities to explore and exploit? Can we differentiate our offering to customers and investors taking industry-leading positions in response to climate change? All right. So up next, Joshua will be speaking about ESG, environmental, social, and governance disclosures. Climate risk is one element of ESG, but the two are not the same. ESG involves measurement and action on reducing your business impacts across a broad set of environmental, social, and governance factors. On the other hand, climate risk relates specifically to managing the impact of climate change on your business. With that said, I'll hand it over to you, Joshua.
Thanks a lot, Zin, and a very good afternoon to all participants today who have taken the time to join us today. I'm Joshua Ryan from JRC, and it gives me great pleasure to talk to you a little bit about ESG disclosures, set some ideas on how to strengthen your ESG disclosures going forward, right? So with that, I will share my deck. So a quick introduction to JRC. Now, we are a leading ESG guidance advisory firm in the country. We also specialize in reporting. When we talk about ESG guidance and advisory, what we mean is we don't just do reports, we actually do the whole gamut of ESG related services, right? So it's board awareness, board briefing, development of policies and strategies, maturity assessment, stakeholder prioritization, and basically all the things that you require to then achieve good ESG disclosures, right? The framework, structures, and policies. That's what we have been doing for clients for a number of years. With regards to integrated reporting, we are one of 2 certified VRF training partners in Malaysia. VRF stands for the Value Reporting Foundation, which is the foremost body that governs integrated reporting. So we represent the VRF here in Malaysia to a certain extent. In terms of training, we are a licensed training partner, which means that if you train with us, you get a London-based certificate from the VRF, right? It also gives us access to the VRF to bring in latest information about the integrated reporting in terms of developments, what's happening in the world of IR, right? We are also members of GRI, which some of you may know is one of the foremost bodies for sustainability reporting. We contribute a fair bit to the development of standards, providing feedback, participating in forums and things like that. Recently, we have joined SASB as well as a consultant content program member, and I believe we're the first one in Malaysia to do so. So we are also involved in what we call doing hybrid climate disclosures, where we link GRI disclosures with SASB disclosures as well to help companies actually achieve more comprehensive ESG reporting, right? As I started out this presentation, we talked about, we do a lot of guidance and advisory work. So we've done physical sessions. This particular year, with the pandemic and the developments from the pandemic, we have done a lot of online sessions as well for both IR as well as ESG. If you like some complimentary information or tools and materials on corporate reporting in Malaysia, our LinkedIn blog basically has a lot of information that you can use on a complimentary basis. And we've had the pleasure and privilege of working with many clients to produce integrated reports. I think in Malaysia, it's about 40 to 50 IR reports already. And of course, SR reports as well over time. We've also had the chance or the opportunity to work with clients in the region. And we hope with the pandemic, kind of abating a little bit, we'll have able to expand on our international portfolio as well. Very quickly, we also work with a lot of clients to help them qualify or retain their position in the FTSE4Good Index. So for those who are not unfamiliar, the FTSE4Good Index is an index of companies that have good ESG performance or good ESG disclosure. And we have journeyed with these clients of ours to actually help them to maintain their position or to actually get on the index. So this is also one of our highlights for us as well. We know the disclosures and have helped them actually close gaps to basically get into the index or to stay on the index. And we draw from an international team. So it's not just us in Malaysia. We also have colleagues and peers from around the world. And this is important because other jurisdictions perhaps are more mature and more developed in terms of particular disclosures for ESG. So we're able to draw from their insights and their experiences to help our national clients close gaps, right? So that's a little bit about us. And so let's get on with the presentation proper. And we'll start off by first looking at where do Malaysian companies stand in terms of ESG disclosures, right? So recently there was a study by Bursa Malaysia together in collaboration with the MSWG, Minority Shareholder Watchdog Group, where 300 PLCs were sampled, right? And this were the results that came out from that study, where it says that, for the most part, Malaysian companies are disclosing on ESG, right? About 93%, they've got some form or some level of disclosure. But in terms of the quality of disclosure, right, that's where we're still lacking. It's about 68% in terms of the quality. So quantitative, we are pretty good. Qualitative, we're still lacking. But I'll give you another perspective on terms of this, right? So this is a list of companies that are listed on Bursa Malaysia, of course. And you can get this list of companies basically from the Bursa website. So this is actually, companies have been rated by Bursa on a ranking of 1 to 4 stars, 1 being poor, 4 being excellent. So we did a bit of math on the companies that have listed, and you arrive at a score of about 2.44 on average. So that's just about slightly better than perhaps being on just like in the middle, right? Slightly better than that, and that's actually quite a big gap from like 68% that was earlier shown. So we think actually there's a lot more room for improvement in terms of the quality of disclosures for Malaysian companies, right? And if you look at stats from across the globe, just go and do a search, you'll find that, 60% of companies in Malaysia, or 100 publicly surveyed companies in Malaysia, they provide commitment to climate action, but you only have like about 6 companies listed on out of 1,800 companies who have a science-based target. So again, there aims to be some kind of superficial or preliminary disclosure, motherhood statements, but in terms of concerted, committed, real action, targets and goals and things like that, we are still very lacking. So we went a step further because we think that a lot of the stats you can get from the market, right, from external sources. So for this particular session, right, JRC has done an exclusive analysis, right? It's only for this session, where we looked at a bunch of companies, they're not listed issuers, right? We analyzed these companies using multiple different sustainability frameworks. So you see a few here already, right? We brought all of them together and we came up with what we call our JRC gap analysis, or traffic light system gap analysis, right? So this is what we do for our clients. So gap analysis, as I explained later in this presentation, is very important, assessing, finding out the areas you need to improve on and how do you actually close those gaps. And the first step is actually doing an assessment of the sort. So our traffic light system basically says, red is absent or lacking disclosure, blue is basically best practice. So overall, on average, for most companies, now this may not apply to all companies, but probably to a good many in Malaysia. If you're looking at environmental disclosures, we are really lacking. Now, there's usually some mention across the board, and some companies really do have good disclosure, but on the whole, right, we are lacking. We're lacking in terms of climate change and emission disclosures, energy disclosures, no KPIs or targets, biodiversity as well. It's not really being given a lot of priority. And really, in terms of environmental disclosures, we are lacking quite a fair bit. And if you start bringing in other frameworks like TCFD and so on, you'll find there's a really major gap. And we really need to really improve on those disclosures, especially on the environment side. Social side, it's a bit better because a lot of data is actually available through HR in terms of like employee numbers and workforce breakdown and things like that. But again, there are some areas where we're still lacking, things like grievance mechanisms, whistleblowing, human rights, training data, freedom of association and stuff like that, as well as supply chain related data. Now, supply chain is becoming a very, very big issue right now. A lot of companies, in recent years, especially in the past 2 years, are being faulted for supply chain issues, right? Third-party issues and things like that. So looking into the social performance of the supply chain is also important, but a lot of companies do not disclose this. And being able to have provide some level of visibility or oversight on your social performance, especially your supply chain, is going to help a lot in terms of avoiding a lot of issues or impacts later on. Governance, we do quite well in governance because we've got very very what we call concrete or very comprehensive frameworks to follow or adhere to. Bursa Malaysia listing requirements, MCCG, Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance. We've got risk frameworks and things like that. So governance-wise, in terms of what we need to, how we report on things, it's Malaysia is I think one of the leading jurisdictions in the region, if not in Asia. The next two is leadership and strategy and value creation. So leadership and strategy and value creation, again, these two are linked together. So you tend to see now in reports, message from the leadership, message from the senior decision maker in terms of what is ESG and how ESG is important to them and so on. But again, the way the messages are usually crafted, it gives a very high level focus, very lot of motherhood statements. There's a lacking of things that you can latch on to, like goals and targets, highlights and achievements, what the board has done for that particular year. These are the kind of key things that are missing in those leadership messages. And it shows that sustainability perhaps has not been fully integrated or embedded within the strategic level of strategic thinking of the organization. It's still a bit disparate and still a bit distinct from the business focus. And that would be a loss of opportunity, because sustainability can be used to create lots of value, lots of opportunities going forward. I believe Zin has also touched on that a little bit in her presentation. So sustainability should not just be reviewed as something to, it's just to mitigate against risk, just for compliance. It should be used as a stepping stone or a catalyst to actually create value for organization, to drive opportunities. So that kind of approach is still lacking in our disclosures. Stakeholder engagement, yes, a lot of companies do it to a good degree. Then they provide some information in terms of how they engage stakeholders. But what perhaps is missing is stakeholder prioritization. Who are their most important stakeholders? And how does stakeholders influence materiality, right? The material topics, the material ESG topics. That part usually is still left out as well. And then it brings me to the final part, which is materiality, of course. So again, materiality is very important because it helps to identify what are your key ESG issues. Rather than trying to report about everything, it's important to know what are your key ESG issues so that resources and focus is not diluted, and you can actually focus and prioritize those things. And really, it's an 80-20 thing. Materiality tells you that, if you address these 20% of issues, you will get 80% of results. Again, there's no proper explanation of how the materiality has been done. Most of it is done internally. There's no external involvement or stakeholder involvement, which would mean that results may not be as accurate as it should be, right? So that's a little bit about our gap analysis, or in terms of the industry as a whole. So in a nutshell, what does that actually mean? Well, if you're looking on a step ladder of, say, 1 to 4, compliance being the lowest and value creation being the higher end, most companies are still somewhere between 1 to 1.5. Now, again, I'll mention that there are companies who are already climbed or scaled the step ladder to a certain extent. Some are already at the value creation, but they are the exception more than the norm. For the most part, Malaysian companies are still very much compliance driven, or doing things because their stakeholders or investors are saying you need to do this, right? So it's good if companies can start looking at ESG as something more than just we have to do it, but something that we should do because it generates a lot of value and benefit for the group, for the organization. Right. So what are the drivers that are actually pushing ESG in the market today? What are drivers that companies should actually take note of and be mindful of? Well, compliance, of course. So we'll go back and talk a little bit about compliance. Now, the point here is that compliance is not the same as it was before, say 3 to 5 years or even 10 years ago. Compliance now, just to comply, it's getting even harder, and there's more things that are required. For example, Bursa Malaysia and MCCG are already trying to introduce, linkage of ESG targets and criteria to board and senior management remuneration, which means that if you, for example, reduce carbon emissions by 3%, that's going to be a factor that affects remuneration. So a lot of companies are working with us in terms of how do we tackle this and how do we address this in terms of mechanisms and so on and things like that. So if you're looking at just that, it means that you also need to set targets for ESG performance already. So not just making general statements that we will see what we can do. It's a best effort kind of basis. We aspire, we strive. It's important now that you need to have fixed targets going forward as well, right? And of course, there's a lot of push in terms of gender. MCCG 2021 is asking for companies to actually achieve 30% women directors on their board. So it's a matter of comply, or if you don't comply, then you need to explain, right? And in terms of when you plan to achieve this timeline. So these are the things, the basic things for compliance in Saudi. You can see it's a lot more demanding, if I could use that word, for companies to actually focus on. So it's time to actually make those jumps and to close those gaps. What Bursa is doing, right? It's not something that is kind of unique. You will find this happening across almost all frameworks or jurisdictions as well. So we'll just look at one, which is FTSE for Good. This is the FTSE for Good requirements for climate change disclosure for level 1. So why is this important? Because if you wish to qualify for FTSE for Good or to stay on the index, you need to have at least level 1 disclosure. For some companies, if you see this list of companies at the bottom here, they basically need to achieve level 3, which is a lot more, how do I put it, it's a lot more demanding, right? But even level 1, you need to think of certain things. So I put the red boxes there for this is basically what you need to have for level 1 already. So it's no more just being silent on climate change. You really need to have something of substance as part of your disclosures. So FTSE for Good is already asking for that. We have clients who have been told by FTSE, yes, you're on the index, but if you do not address your climate change disclosures, for example, you're going to be out. And we have worked with them to do certain things to get statements out, put on the website, things like that, to address this as well. So the ramping up of basic disclosures for compliance is already increasing, and it's only going to get more and more with time. The next one, of course, is investor push. So this is EPF, and they've got an ESG rating tool to assess quality of ESG aspects among investee companies. So the thing about investors or frameworks and all that, the first stop for looking at a company's ESG performance is usually your sustainability report, right? They do look at other things as well, and they of course take it from there and do a more thorough assessment. But the first stop is usually a sustainability report. So having a good report is actually, really advantageous to a company. Okay, that's EPF. PNB as well, is coming up with a framework. We have clients who are, who PNB has a stake in them, and the same thing as well, talking about how can we actually close those gaps. And if you look at the Malaysia PRI signatories, principles for responsible investment, there are many of Malaysian signatories already. The numbers increasing. So again, one of the key prerequisites is looking at ESG criteria of the investee company. And likewise, pension funds, almost all pension funds, ESG has an ESG factor involved as well. So these are things that cannot be avoided. ESG is here to stay. And if you want funding the long run, you just have to prioritize your ESG performance. Likewise, Bank Negara, CIMB, Deutsche Bank, a lot of local banks already have various requirements for financing. We've had clients who have faced high cost of financing because they couldn't meet the local banks criteria for being green, and so these are real things that are happening. It's only going to be ramped up even further. Okay, but beyond just investors and compliance, let's talk about what's happening in terms of value creation, right? So here we go. As Zin had also mentioned earlier, and I concur with that fully. A lot of young people today, and unfortunately, we are all getting old. We're not getting younger, and the young people of today will be the leaders of tomorrow for your company. And for them, a company with a conscience is something that's really, really big for them, right? The numbers you can see, they want to know that a company is a good company. It's a company that cares about ESG and it's got its priorities right. And it's proven that among good talent, this is something that's very, very important. They want to work for a company that's doing good, that's a force for good. And if you want to retain good talent, then this is something to consider as well. The next, of course, would be performance. So we are often asked as well, so we do all this ESG stuff, show me the money, where is the return, where is the benefit, right? Is it really going to make me a better company? Well, the statistics show that companies who have a good ESG performance, right, tended to do well during the COVID-19 crisis and even way before. So these were some figures that were also released by EPF as well. EPF's top 10 ESG ranked stocks outperformed the bottom 10 in the first Q of 2020. So the question is why? Why is it that if you focus on ESG, how is it that you actually become better? Well, one would be risk, right? So it shows that if you're taking care of ESG matters, you actually have a much lower risk appetite. I mean, not appetite, risk profile, right? The level of risk for your company is less. So I'm going to use a very simple analogy here, right? It's a bit like a person, an individual. You take yourself if you like. Now, you have a job and you work at it, you put your skills, your experience, your talents, and your energy and effort into it, right? And then you generate an income from that. But there's something else called your health. Now, your health that does not directly contribute to your ability to derive income. But if you do not take care of your health, in the long run, your ability to work and create value is going to be impacted. So ESG is something like that, right? It's like taking care of your health, taking care of your family, all those other surrounding factors that does impact your ability to actually produce value. So that's how it works. So if you have good ESG, it means you're taking care of all the other areas or aspects that will then help you to actually perform better, to be more productive, and to perhaps even have a competitive advantage. Okay. Now, I'm almost at the end of my presentation. So I'd like to leave you with some ideas on how you can actually improve sustainability in your organization as well as sustainability reporting, right? These are areas or ideas that we use for our clients as well. So we're happy to share them with you. And these are things that perhaps you could almost apply immediately, right? So let's go through this very quickly. One, how do you get on this journey? Well, gap analysis. We always suggest to have a gap analysis because simply put, if you want to go forward, you need to know where you are, right? If you want to go to Penang, you need to know whether you're in JB or in KL first before you can decide how you want to get to Penang, right? So that's really important. But how do you do an effective gap analysis? Again, there are ways to do this. We would recommend using the framework that we talked about just now, but there are actually some ways to do it. It's not that technical, but knowing where you are in terms of your reporting and what frameworks to use and apply and adopt is also very important. But anyway, a gap analysis, it's a good way to actually kickstart things because the report actually, the way the gap analysis is done, it will show you the pain points beyond just missing information. It will show you issues in terms of data collection. It will show you issues in terms of processes, the lack of policy, strategy, and a lot of other areas as well. So a good gap analysis is worth, it's worth its weight in gold, if I could say that. Next one, stakeholder engagement and maturity assessment. Prioritize your stakeholders. Quite often, the stakeholder disclosure for most reports is a nice table that says who our stakeholders are, what are their concerns and how we engage with them and so on. But is there a stakeholder prioritization exercise that's actually been done? Who are the more important ones, in terms of the ability to impact the organization? If you could do up like a simple matrix of this sort for your stakeholders, would you be able to do it? And this is important because then you know that this bunch of people over here in the top right corner and their concerns are going to be really very important in terms of how you go forward. So in terms of also influencing your materiality topics as well. So it's important to do a stakeholder prioritization exercise. Next is materiality, identifying, selecting, and confirming the issues so that you know what you're doing in terms of your ESG approach. So if you look at this target diagram here, materiality assessment is right at the heart. It's the bullseye, right at the heart, because from here you would know what are your significant ESG issues, how you're going to address those issues in terms of strategy, action plans, and policies, right? You're then able to focus your resources again, so it's not diluted or wasted. And when you do all these things, eventually you're hitting the right stakeholders as well, and you have stakeholder buy-in. So materiality assessment, when done correctly, it's actually a very, very strategic move for ESG. Okay, policy and goal setting, right? So we always ask, okay, is a sustainability policy a good idea? Yes, but it's got to have the right stuff inside, or right elements or aspects in terms of the policy. So what goes into a policy? Well, using a very simple 5 Ws, 1 H approach. These are some of the things that you perhaps should be thinking about coming up with your sustainability policy. If you already have one, excellent. Maybe some of these aspects will be useful for you. And from once you've done that, then you can apply the same to other types of policies that you can actually be looking at. So that's climate change policy, anti-corruption, anti-bribery, anti-corruption policy, and so on and so on, right? Okay. Targets. So we always ask about how do we set targets? Okay, so use the SMART approach. Keep targets attainable, and at the same time also what you can do is set targets. For example, if you're not sure, like you're going to plan to reduce, you can use a range to reduce emissions, say by 3 to 5% the next 3 years or 5 years, something like that. Those targets are also acceptable, right? And you set targets, try to set them across the ESG wide spectrum, but also you can start with something that you can actually attain and work your way from there. And what about who is going to champion sustainability in the organization? So a lot of organizations usually find one person, what I would call it one unlucky person, and dump it on that person's head and say, you're in charge of sustainability. But that's not really the way to go. That approach would be a very highly unsustainable. Sustainability is something that cuts through the organization. So therefore, the proper approach, the best practice approach would be cross-functional participation. So if you're having a sustainability working committee, this is what roughly a working committee should compose of. You've got people from finance, human capital, communications, business units, and so on, so that you have a well-rounded approach to sustainability and it actually have the buy-in from across the organization. So at my final slide, what's happening in terms of ESG? Well, for many years, value creation was this particular, let's call this particular area on the left, right? It's basically financial values. Value creation was equated to financial values. ESG was, perhaps not even in the picture, or it was quite disparate or distinct from financial values. You had ESG disclosures, but there was no connection in terms of how ESG is linked to financial values and value creation. That's changed, right? With the introduction of integrated reporting, and that really has changed. Today, everyone is of the view that ESG values and financial values come together to talk about value creation, which means they are both interlinked and interrelated, and they want companies to understand that linkage and to narrate their corporate story in terms of that linkage. So this is where we are now, and this is what we call good best practice sustainability reporting, or even integrated reporting. This is where you actually need to be focused on. This is what you need to think about. How is ESG influencing value creation for the organization? Okay, and with that, I'm happy to end my presentation. And I think we're going to be opening the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Joshua, for the very interesting and informative presentation. So now we're open to any questions on the floor. If there are no questions and you think of any later on, please feel free to email us and we can respond to your questions through email. Okay, thanks everyone for coming. We hope to see you at the next event.